In this video, we're going to take a look at Atramentis Artist Black. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. This is a solid performing black, just as a writing ink. No tone variation, no shading, like I like a good black to be. With a Fude nib, it can shade though. What I would call a dry brush effect, and considering the nib, I accept it and think that that's pretty good, especially since Fude is supposed to be replicating like a brush. I think the real question is this ink for art? Does it replace platinum carbon black? No, not for me. But I've been using platinum carbon black for so long that it's almost hard to consider something else. This does do very good. I just find that the platinum carbon black holds on to its being black better after watercolor has gone over it, where this one didn't as well perform in watercolor. It did perform very well, just not as well as carbon black for me. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Nimicine Fission with a broad nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the standard AmPad nib, we get a solid dark black tone with no feather, no spread, no shading, just beautiful black on the page. Looking at the gold nib, it looks exactly like the standard AmPad, with no feather, no spread, no shading. It's doing fantastic. The Fude nib, because of its thicker lines, might look like it's darker, but in fact is the same dark black that we had with the standard and the gold. Not feathering, not spreading. You see only in the word way on this paper that kind of dry brush effect happening, so it's not really shading, it is just getting a little bit of that dry brush. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and no problems. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Noodler's AHAB with an extra fine nib. A Noodler's AHAB with a medium nib. A Noodler's AHAB with a 1.1 stub nib. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes Steno notebook. Looking at the standard AHAB nib, it is the same black tone that we were getting on the Clairfontaine. We are getting a slight bit of some feather. You see it at the top of the H on while. And that's pretty much it, but there is just that little bit. There's no spread, there's no shading, just a good, solid, performing black ink. Looking at the gold nib, we get the same tone that's from the standard AHAB. Lost my words. It's the same black tone that we got on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather here. I don't know why I had that spot of feathering up before, but it was only that one spot. It does not spread. It does not shade. It does a great job. Looking at the Fude nib, same black tone. Now we do get some feathering, and we do get some regular feathering all the way through it. You can fairly spot feathering in just about any word. It's hard to say whether or not it is spreading. I don't see it as spreading on this page. I don't think it has very good performance on this paper with a Fude nib. Looking at the back of the page, the Fude nib got quite deep into the paper because it is a much wetter pen. But nothing bled through touching the page underneath, and we don't have any ghosting problem. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in an AmPad Steno notebook. Looking at the standard AHAB nib, it is a little bit lighter of black than we had on the Clairfontaine, more an effect of the paper. We do get some very tiny feathers on it. We don't get any spread. We don't get any shading. So I would say this is doing pretty good considering it's the paper that's making it look a little less dull as a black. Looking at the gold nib, we get the same tone that we had with the standard AHAB. We still get a little bit tiny feathers, just little there. They're not distracting, but you can spot them. Really, where my eye is drawn the most is on the fourth line of the word projects, where I just see it a bunch. It's not spreading, it's not shading. It is doing a very good job. Looking at the Fude nib, same black tone, still just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, again, the paper. It does feather a little bit. It's not spreading, it's not shading, it's not a good nib to use on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, there are 3 spots that I'm pointing to where it did touch the page underneath, but those were tiny spots. Seeing the back of the page, you see there's a lot of ghosting and no ability to write back here. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a national Steno notebook. Looking at the standard AmPad nib, it is the same black tone that we had on the Clairfontaine, so it's not being as affected by this paper. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's not shading. Well done. Looking at the gold nib, it's the same black tone as the standard AmPad. No feather, no spread, no shading. Again, well done. Looking at the Fude nib, it is the same black tone that we had on the Clairfontaine, same as with the gold and the standard AmPad on this paper. It does feather quite a bit, not something I'm really used to seeing on this paper. It doesn't spread, it doesn't shade. Whew. Looking at that first word, buildings, the feather's gross. Looking at the back of the page, this one dot that has been circled, that is the one spot where it actually did touch the page underneath. I just think it was a freaky moment, to be honest. Looking at the rest of it, nothing bled through, touched the page underneath, and in fact, the ghosting's not bad. You could easily write back here. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Califolio Noir. Here is Caran d'Ache Cosmic Black. Here is Krishna Empty. Here is Noodler's Black Eel. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot Steno notebook. Looking at the standard AmPad nib, we get the same black tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feather. We get no spread. We get no shading. We get a beautiful dark black ink the entire way. Absolutely loving how this is looking. Looking at the gold nib, it is the same tone that we had with the standard AmPad, with no feather, no spread, no shading, just solid black line goodness. Looking at the Fude nib, we get the same tone that we had with the gold and the standard AHAB. Same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We have no feathering. We have no spread. We have no shading. It's unfortunate that I don't have the artwork as a part of what's here. I just don't tend to always share my artwork. Looking at the back of the page, you see that nothing bled through and touched the page underneath. Ghosting is well under control. You could easily be writing on the back of this page. While it's nice to compare it to other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a magenta ink by Diamine Maroon. Here is a pink ink by Pen BBS, their number 129 Zhu Jimo. Here is a yellow shimmering ink by Diamine, their Golden Sands. Here is a red ink by Platinum, their Red. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the standard AHAB nib, we get the same dark tone that we had with the Clairfontaine. It has been so consistent here. It does feather a tiny little bit, really tiny little bit. It does spread, and it's quite noticeable when you look on them side by side. It's not shading at all. I actually think it's doing very well with this paper. Looking at the gold nib, we get the same tone that we had with the standard AHAB nib. It does feather a little bit. It does spread a little bit. It does not shade at all. And as long as this ink doesn't bleed through, if you need permanent ink and you need to use copy paper, I'm hoping this doesn't bleed through because I think we could have a real winner. Looking at the Fude nib, the nib that exposes all weaknesses of paper and inks. Same black tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, it does spread, it does not shade. It does a great job in reality just because of how super wet this pen is. I wouldn't use it for writing on this other than for these reviews. I use a Fude nib for fun doing artwork. Looking at the page underneath, it is only the Fude nib that bled through to the other side. Both the gold and the standard AHAB nib did great. Now, I don't know if you would want to write on the back of the page because of the ghosting, but you might be allowed to if you wanted to. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? It is a dealer's choice, without a doubt. But let's go for a Fude nib because when you're moving quickly, you get that dry brush effect that is damaging to brushes, but not this ink in a Fude nib. And for the purposes of doing art, it does so well with it that I can absolutely see pairing this for art purposes. So the fact that it is their art line means to me it is doing a great job. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to support the channel, you can over on Patreon. Thanks for watching.